You'll often come across heated debates online about what our ancestors really ate. But honestly, these arguments are pretty pointless. Over millions of years, species changed their diets multiple times. Take the distant ancestor of modern cows, for example. It was actually a small omnivorous mammal. And fun fact, early mammals being omnivores was more common than you might think. But the most energy-hungry organ in any body, that's the brain. In humans, it makes up just 2% of total body mass, but burns a whopping 20% of all energy, more than all other organs combined. Around 2 million years ago, our ancestors' brains started growing rapidly, which meant they needed new energy sources. Surprisingly, one of the first major ones might not have been meat, but bone marrow. Predators often leave bones behind, and cracking them open is no easy task. But our ancestors, being the resourceful beings they were, figured out that stones could do the job. This unlocked access to an incredibly high-energy food source. Bone marrow is packed with protein and fat, making it 2.5 times more calorie-dense than, say, bananas. More importantly, unlike carb-heavy foods, it keeps you full for longer. Plus, the brain can use more than just glucose. It can also run on ketone bodies, which the body produces when fasting or consuming a high-fat, high-protein diet. Animal fats play a crucial role in brain function. In one of my previous videos, I mentioned studies showing that increasing fat intake improved cognitive function in people with Alzheimer's. Not surprising, considering 60% of the brain's dense tissue is made up of fats. By shifting toward an animal-based diet, our ancestors didn't just supercharge their brain size and supplement it with ketones. They also developed physiological traits similar to predators. In fact, in 2021, researchers from Portugal and Israel analyzed 400 scientific studies on human diets over the past 2.5 million years. Their conclusion? For most of that time, the human diet was predominantly animal-based. This aligns with a study by Dr. Maria Dobrovolskaya, which found that Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens occupied a food chain position similar to hyenas, while Neanderthals were more like wolves and bears. A slight increase in plant-based food consumption began about 20,000 years ago, just before the rise of agriculture. And by the way, over the past several tens of thousands of years, the average human brain size has actually shrunk from 1,500 cubic centimeters to 1,350. Now, I know someone's going to argue that intelligence isn't just about brain size, and sure, we could talk about neuron density and all that, but here's the thing: civilization allows us to pool our brain power, like a massive supercomputer. So even if the processor of an individual brain degrades, as long as there are enough of them working together, progress keeps happening. And honestly, with AI advancing so fast, human intelligence itself might soon lose its value. But let's get back on track. About 10,000 years ago, with the rise of agriculture, humanity made another drastic dietary shift, massively increasing carbohydrate consumption. This transition happened so quickly that it probably wasn't great for our health. That's when we started encountering issues like cavities and other fun diseases. Before that, eating mostly animal-based foods provided enough sodium chloride, salt, naturally. It's worth remembering that life first evolved in the salty ocean, and even after leaving it, all living things still carry sodium chloride in their blood and tissues. Sodium and chloride are key ions in extracellular fluid. They're essential for transporting nutrients between cells, transmitting nerve impulses, contracting muscles, and maintaining water balance. On top of that, chloride is necessary for producing stomach acid. And two types of immune cells, neutrophils and macrophages, actually create literal bleach to kill bacteria and fungi. When they capture harmful microbes, they surround them and poison them with chlorine, which of course requires sodium chloride. When diets shifted in the Neolithic era, this became a big issue, since plant-based foods couldn't provide enough salt. That's why, from ancient times up until the 19th century, salt was incredibly valuable. Now here's where things get tricky. I've seen claims online that old coins like soldi and sold were originally minted from salt. But let's be real. The internet is full of kitchen table linguistics and questionable facts, especially since the Latin word for salt is sal, and in French, it's sel. Some people even argue that salt is the root of the English word salary and the French salaire. People with vivid imaginations have worked hard on this, so it's often hard to separate fact from fiction. Even the etymology of words like salary and wages is debated in Western internet circles. Most agree that there's no solid evidence supporting this origin, though salt was indeed a valuable and widely traded commodity. I've also seen theories that the Roman name for the Celts, Gauls, comes from the Greek word for salt, hals, and that early Germanic coins called hellers were originally made of salt. But again, this all comes from some pretty questionable sources. Plus, Gauls likely comes from the Latin gallus, meaning rooster. There's also a claim that soldier literally means one who is paid in salt, based on the idea that Roman soldiers were given salt as part of their wages during the Punic Wars. There's a reason for this. Long and exhausting marches through areas without natural salt deposits, plus the fact that salt wasn't just a spice, but also a form of currency. However, Cambridge historian Peter Gainsford points out that Roman legionaries were indeed given a salarium, but that was extra money meant to buy salt, not actual sacks of the stuff. Besides, salt production in Rome was fairly stable, and by the 2nd century BCE, things were more or less sorted. According to Polybius, a Roman soldier earned about a third of a denarius per day, which could buy him over 6.5 kilograms of salt. The Romans used it for dental hygiene, and as stated in the Apicius cookbook, they believed, rightfully so, that it aided digestion. Dr. James de Nicolantonio estimates that the average daily salt intake back then was around 25 grams. As for the word soldier, it actually comes from a small coin used to pay mercenaries, so even if it has any connection to salt, it's a very distant one. That said, I've come across records in the Hypatian Chronicle about Prince Danil paying his warriors in salt while fighting the Boyars in Galicia. Back then, the economy wasn't market-based. It was all about bartering valuable resources. Payments could be made in silver, iron, rare furs, grain, or indeed salt. In Africa, according to academician Alexander Fersman, even in relatively modern times, 1 kilogram of salt could be traded for 1 kilogram of gold dust. And in Ethiopia, salt money was still in use as late as the 1930s. 5 brick-sized salt bars could buy a slave. Most people, however, couldn't afford pure salt and had to make do with mildly salted ash from certain trees. The use of salt as currency is an interesting topic, but solid evidence is mostly found for Africa and China. In Europe, it's often just speculative claims. No matter where you go, though, salt has always been a valuable commodity, not just for its role in human physiology, but for its other properties as well. It was essential for food preservation, which was a big problem in the past. Plus, salt water has mild antiseptic properties by today's standards, and also works as an absorbent, drawing out impurities from wounds. Not the most pleasant procedure, but rinsing wounds with salt water or applying salt-soaked bandages significantly reduced the risk of infection and festering. I've come across claims that during the French retreat in 1812, many wounded soldiers died because a lack of salt impaired wound healing. But to be honest, it's unclear whether this refers to salt's medical use or its direct effect on the healing process. Regardless, as a dietary supplement, salt played a crucial role in military life. The need for salt is directly linked to physical activity. If you sit in an office all day, you might only need a few grams from food. But aerobic exercise, especially in hot conditions, can cause a person to lose 5 to 6 grams of sodium per hour through sweat. I've seen claims that a professional American football player can lose up to 60 grams of salt in a single training session. They often compensate with electrolyte drinks containing various salts. Recommended salt intake is pretty arbitrary and depends on lifestyle, more specifically physical activity and climate. It's obvious that being a soldier meant constant movement and exertion. No surprise, then, that samurai, for example, received 16 grams of salt per person daily, well above modern recommendations by the WHO and other health organizations. According to Dr. James de Nicolantonio, Scandinavians consumed up to 100 grams of salt per day, thanks to their heavily salted foods. In the 18th century Russian Imperial Army, 75 kopecks were allocated for a soldier's daily salt ration, compared to only 73 for meat. That worked out to about 47 grams of salt per soldier per day. One symptom of salt deficiency is general weakness, not exactly ideal for a fighting force. For instance, in the Red Army, a decree from March 6, 1934, set the daily soldier's ration at 30 grams of salt. By the 1980s, this was reduced to 20 grams. Salt deprivation also messes with water balance, making the body lose fluids faster and increasing thirst. That's why, when reading about 19th century military campaigns or 20th century forced marches, you might come across references to soldiers eating salted herring before such events. It didn't quench thirst, if anything, it made it worse, but it helped the body retain water for much longer, meaning soldiers could go without drinking for extended periods. And no, stuffing yourself with extra salt won't make you stronger or healthier. Too much or too little of anything rarely leads to good results. But the 20th century was a weird time. Some dietitians, armed with sketchy data, decided to go after traditional foods. Animal fats, red meat, things humans had been eating for millions of years, all got demonized. And salt didn't escape the hit list either, which wouldn't be such a big deal if it wasn't happening at the same time as the rise of cheap, highly profitable trans fats, carb-loaded processed foods, sugar, and mass-produced chicken. I'm no doctor, so I won't go into the skyrocketing rates of diabetes, heart disease, and other health issues. But let's be real, history has always had its fair share of questionable choices. That said, traditional cuisine is a system of eating refined over centuries, even millennia. When you swap it for margarine, overload on quick carbs, constantly snack, and throw meal timing out the window, you need to understand, you're running a dangerous experiment on yourself. And trust me, I've had more than enough personal experience in this area.